Hello everyone, and welcome to my Ultimate F1 2013 guide. In this video I'll be walking you through the rule changes, the talking points of the year, tyre changes, team changes, driver changes, calendar changes, and of course a little form guide at the end. So, first up then is the rule changes. Number 1 is the addition of a vanity panel to cover the step noses. So we had a lot of these ugly step noses in Formula 1 last year, making a lot of the cars look very ugly. But this year they've agreed to a few rule changes to allow a vanity panel to cover the step up. So it's got to be non-structural, so pretty much just a carbon fibre cover. So actually if you take the cover off, it would still be a step nose underneath. But they've allowed that to make the cars look prettier, as you can see here on the Ferrari. So it's a perfectly almost straight nose there. And a lot of cars will also have that vanity panel, as we'll discover later in the video. Number 2 is stricter front wing flexibility tests. So last year some of the top teams, namely Red Bull and McLaren, were flexing the front wings at high speed, mainly backwards slightly so it could reduce a bit of drag, but this year they've increased the weight and the position of the tests that they do before every race in order to ensure that that doesn't happen this year. So moving on then, number 3 is only use DRS in DRS zones during practice and qualifying. As I'm sure you remember from last year, the drivers were able to use DRS at any point on the track during both practice and qualifying, but this year they will only be able to use the DRS in the DRS zones. Number 4 is Mercedes style active DRS is banned. So last year then, Mercedes had a special kind of DRS whereby when they would open the rear wing, that would expose some holes in the rear wing end plates and the air would run through some pipes right the way through to the front of the car and would then also stall the front wing as well as the rear wing. So that would mean they would get a bigger straight line speed advantage, but obviously that was quite a complicated system, so they didn't want it going too far, so they've banned that for this year. And finally then, it's not really a rule change for this year, but we've got some big rule changes coming for 2014, so all teams will be developing for next year. So even right now, the teams will all be developing their 2014 cars, because it's quite a big change, mainly the engine regulations, so don't expect as much development as we had last year. Next up then is talking points. These are the things I think you'll be hearing about more throughout the season. First up then is the passive drag reduction device, also referred to as double DRS, DDRS, passive DRS and DRD. This is the device that was trialled by Lotus for much of last year, as I'm sure you remember from around Spa they started trying it. And this year it's been tried so far by about 4 teams, and I'll let you know which teams they are a little bit later on. And essentially what it does is above a certain speed it will stall the rear wing and then cause it obviously to drop some drag and you can go a bit faster in a straight line. But it's very, very tricky to get it working because the speed at which it activates at is not the same as the speed at which it deactivates at for a start, and obviously because it's stalling the rear wing and it's passive, so it just does it above a certain speed, you don't want it happening in the high downforce corners when you really do need that rear downforce. So no teams have really got it properly working yet, but that will definitely be a talking point for this season. Number 2 is the Coanda effect exhausts. Ted Kravitz did a fantastic explanation of this. If you watch his notebooks, he used the example of a tap and a spoon. So if you turn a tap on and put the back of a spoon under the flowing water, the water will tend to follow the curvature of the spoon, which is exactly what the F1 cars are doing at the back. As a few years ago they introduced a new exhaust regulations whereby the exhausts have to point upwards and have to be in a certain area, and there's a lot of, very specific rules they introduced around it. But basically they're using the curvature of the channel just outside the exhaust to make the air stick to the car and then flow down into the diffuser where it's much more usable. And finally then, step noses or vanity panel. I've already touched on this in the rule changes, but it will definitely be a talking point for this year, as some teams have decided to stick with the step nose and other teams have decided to go with the vanity panel. As I said, I will get onto specifics towards the end of this video when I go through each team, but it's an interesting face-off between weight and aerodynamic ability, so a few teams are saying that they're not going to install one until they can gain more of an aerodynamic benefit, so should be interesting to see which way teams go. So next up is tyre changes. Pirelli have made 2 changes for this year, the first of which is they've made the hard tyre orange so it's easier to differentiate between the others. So as you can see there, we've got green for intermediates, blue for full wets, red for super soft, yellow for soft, silver for medium and orange now for hard, so hopefully it'll be a little bit easier to tell which tyres the cars are on. The second change they've made is to make them less durable but have a bigger operating window. So I'm sure you can remember the beginning of last year was a bit of a lottery, and that's because the tyres had such a small temperature operating window that the teams were really struggling just to get it in there all the time. But this year they should have a bigger operating window, so it should be a little bit easier for the teams to manage them. And also they are less durable, so they won't last quite as long, which is good because obviously towards the end of last year they were all on 1 stop, so hopefully we should be back to 2 or 3 stops now. Next then we have team changes. The first and probably biggest change is that we've lost HRT. This was for financial reasons, as the owners bought the team with an eye of making a profit, which obviously didn't work, and then they just couldn't find a buyer as it was in the middle of Spain and no one really wanted the team based there. So it just didn't work out for them, unfortunately, and that means we'll now be down to 11 teams this season. Next up then is that Marusia have gained KERS. So much like Caterham did last year, they've taken on a KERS unit. It's been supplied by Williams and it means that all 11 teams have now got KERS. And finally, Infinity are now a title Red Bull sponsor. All this really means for us is that Infinity will now be more prominently displayed on the car, and it also means that Red Bull are now officially called Infinity Red Bull Racing. So next up we have the driver changes. So first and foremost, I'm sure you've already heard that Lewis Hamilton has moved from McLaren to Mercedes. I won't talk about it too much in this video, but what I will say is how to tell the difference between his and Nico Rosberg's helmet. So Lewis Hamilton has got a darker shade of yellow, so that's one way to tell. And the other thing is that Nico Rosberg has got a silver square in the middle just above his visor that Lewis Hamilton hasn't got. So that's probably the best way to tell. So I'm just going to rattle through these from now then. So we've got Sergio, nicknamed Chico Perez, who's gone from Sauber to McLaren to replace Lewis Hamilton. So it'll be interesting to see how he gets on alongside Jenson Button. We've got Nico Hülkenberg, who's gone from Force India to Sauber, seen by a sidestep by most. Esteban Gutierrez, who's gone from GP2 up to a Sauber race seat. Adrian Sutil, who has effectively come out of retirement after that court case against him, gone back into Force India. Valtteri Bottas has gone from a test driver at Williams to a full race driver seat at Williams. Charles Pic has gone from Marusia to Caterham, once again a bit of a sidestep really. Guido van der Garde has gone from GP2 up to a full race seat at Caterham, from Caterham in GP2. Jules Bianchi has gone from a Force India test driver to a Marusia full race seat, and Max Chilton has gone from GP2 up to Marusia. Just before we get onto the form guide, we've got calendar changes. So first up then, the New Jersey race, which would have had the New York backdrop, has that's been delayed by 1 year unfortunately, so that means we should see it next year, but it means we are down to 19 races again this year. And that's because Valencia has moved to alternate with Barcelona. Much like Germany's done for many years, Valencia is going to be every other year with Barcelona each year in between. So that means this year we'll have Barcelona and next year it'll be Valencia. And as just said with Germany, we've got the Nürburgring instead of Hockenheim. That's because they alternate year on year. So this year it's Nürburgring and next year it'll be Hockenheim. And now we're on to the exciting bit, it's the form guide. I'm going to be running you through each and every team, telling you what's been happening so far this year. First of all, I just want to say a big thank you to f1technical.net. They've allowed me to use some of their images and they've got some fantastic technical analysis on their website, so go and check them out. Okay, we'll be going in championship order, so first up is Red Bull. First thing you'll notice is the whacking great Infinity logo on the side pod. That's obviously down to the new title sponsorship, and it also brings with it a more purple tinge to the livery. You can see it's a little bit purple there. The other thing you'll notice is it has still got a stepped nose on it. That is actually a small vanity panel there. It's just very small though, and they say that's just to reduce weight. They can't see enough advantage to have a huge vanity panel on the front, so they've just done just a little small one, and that also covers up the vent that was underneath there last year. It is fundamentally an evolution of the RB8, last year's car. This is the RB9. It's an evolution, although I'm sure it'll be very changed, but it is still an evolution, as was the last few cars. They've had to strengthen the front wing due to the new flexibility test, which I touched on earlier, so that's been strengthened. There doesn't show any of these images, I haven't got any of it unfortunately, but there is a new air inlet under the nose and an air outlet over the nose. So that is to take some of the high pressure air from underneath the nose and squirt it out at the top, just to try and keep the airflow nice and neat over the top of the car. That's what that is for, but unfortunately I haven't got any images of it. Sauber also running a similar thing. They have actually tested the double DRS concept, or whatever you want to call it, the passive DRS, DRD, whatever you want to call it. They've tested that in testing. I'm not sure we'll see it in the races for a few more, but they've clearly got it in the pipeline, so that could well be introduced to the Red Bull later on in the season. And throughout testing, they've looked very quick and reliable, and are widely expected to be the fastest car come Melbourne. So next up, it's Ferrari and the F138, and the first thing you'll notice is they've got a whacking great vanity panel on the front, complete opposite way to Red Bull. So they have obviously got a step underneath that vanity panel, but you won't be able to see it, so they've got a really big one, so it's almost flat all the way down, right from the monocoque right down to the tip of the nose. The other thing they've got is they've retained pull rod front suspension, both front and rear, which means the suspension is pull rather than push. Makes sense. And they have also heavily redesigned the rear end, because last year they just couldn't get the commander exhaust working quite right, so they've heavily redesigned that, so I'm sure they'll be much quicker this year at the rear end at least. They've also introduced the 2014 control unit early, so the ECU unit that's ready for 2014, they've introduced that a year early, so that should save them a few teething problems ready for next year, so that's an interesting choice. There's also a duct, for some reason, under the nose. We're not really sure where that exits yet, but when they take the front wing off, you can see a little duct inside there. Once again, I haven't got any images, unfortunately. They claim it's driver cooling, but not really too sure where that one goes yet. I'm sure we'll find out soon. It's probably nothing huge, like Red Bull last year. And in terms of testing, they've had a much better winter than last year, so they're certainly quicker than last year. But I wouldn't say they're the fastest, but they're always reliable. And now on to McLaren then, with the MP428. They've actually had a big redesign over the winter. You won't really see it visually too much, but they've changed a lot because they reckon they hit a ceiling of development last year, and they didn't reckon they were going to be able to develop it too much more this year, so they made a big change. The first of which you'll notice is the nose. They've gone for a vanity panel, so they have actually got a step they didn't have last year, but they have actually introduced a step underneath that vanity panel that you won't be able to see, as I said. So it does look very similar to last year, but they have actually changed it under the skin. They've also copied Ferrari in that they've got pull rod front and rear suspension. Most teams do have rear, but they've also gone frontwards on the pull rod instead of push. Interestingly as well, apparently their sideboards are a bit differently shaped than last year. I'm not too sure how that will affect it, to be honest, but they've all been developed, but I'm expecting them to be pretty quick. They've definitely shown flashes of speed during testing, but they've not been very consistent, and they've had a bit of a strange testing, but that's really to be expected when you've got a huge new redesign. It's a few teething issues really, but expect them to be quick this year, and they've been pretty reliable as well. So next up is Lotus. The first thing you'll notice is they've got more red in their livery, so they'll now stand out more on track. Second thing you'll notice is they have actually got a step nose still. I believe it's the same step as they had last year. Once again, same as Red Bull, they just couldn't see the advantage of putting one on there, just too much weight it would cost. We're probably talking grams, but even so. So they've just kept their step nose there. They've also been trialling the double DRS, much like they did for most of last year. They're still trialling it. They were trialling it during testing, but once again, still can't quite get it working just as they would like. Other than that, really, they've been fairly unremarkable during testing, and also just their design. There's been nothing that's been hugely revolutionary about them, but they still look pretty quick. But reliability is a worry, though. Particularly Raikkonen has had particularly bad luck with the reliability, so it's not looking good on that front. And now on to Mercedes then. So the first thing you'll notice is that they have got a vanity panel on the front. They've still got a bit of a step there, so it's not a full vanity panel, but they've certainly improved it. It does look better than last year, I'm sure you'll agree. They have also reshaped the side pods. You can't really see it there too much, but they've reshaped them once again to try and get more rear downforce from the commander effect and also from the air coming around the side pods. Other than that, though, they've pretty much gone back to basics. They've always been trying to be quite technical with their cars and quite complicated, so they've just gone back to basics a little bit with this one, including the DRS, because of course they had that active DRS where it blew the front wing as well last year, but they've obviously gone back to a standard DRS now. They've also been trialling the double DRS during testing. Once again, not really succeeded too much, so I'm not sure we'll see it in the first couple of races, but they are on it. They have been trialling it. But other than that, they have actually been very quick. They were a little bit unreliable in Jerez, but they seem to have sorted that out for Barcelona, and then they were actually extremely reliable in Barcelona, and they've actually looked very quick, so possibly a dark horse for this season. Next up is Sauber. First thing you'll notice is they've got a new grey livery. Well, they were more white last year, so that's an interesting change, just to go more grey there. They've also got an interesting take on the nose vanity panel there. They've actually just done it down the sides, and they've kept the step in the middle, but they've just done sort of almost side rails to the vanity panel, so that's an option in terms of saving weight there, and I'm not sure how that will affect the aerodynamics, but it's an interesting take on it anyway. And the other thing you will notice is that they've got some very, very narrow side pods. They've turned quite a few heads. They've got the most narrow side pods in Formula 1. And they really are so narrow. They've really worked hard on making them narrow, so we'll see how that affects their rear downforce. They've also got a Red Bull style nose vent. I think they're actually the first ones to pioneer it last year, in that it will bring air in underneath the nose and shoot it out at the top in order to stabilise the air going over the car. They've also tried to make this car better qualify, because last year they were very good on the tyres, but because of that they couldn't quite get everything out of it in qualifying, so they'll be trying to do better in qualifying with this car. They've also the final team that's been trialling the double DRS, or the passive DRS, whatever you want to call it. Once again, not too much luck with it really, but that's the fourth team that's been trying it, so I'm sure sooner or later someone will make a breakthrough with it and be able to do it reasonably well with it. They look reasonably fast during testing, much like last year. They've not really made huge strides forward, I wouldn't say really. They're probably going to be in a similar position last year, so really head of the midfield behind Lotus and sort of Mercedes around there somewhere, but they have been reliable. And now we have Force India. The first thing you'll notice is they've got a vanity panel to cover up their step nose. You can actually see it there on the side of the nose there, where the vanity panel goes down to, so it's actually quite a large thing that they've put on there to cover it up, but there we go, they've gone for that method on their car. It's fundamentally an evolution of their last car, the VJM05. This is the VJM06. It's an evolution, once again. I think a lot of people are going evolutions because of the big rule changes coming next year. Other than that, once again, it's a fairly unremarkable car, really. There's no huge changes, but they'll be looking for a stronger start than last year, since they got off to quite a slow start last year. In testing, they've looked reasonably fast. Once again, much like last year, really, they've looked reasonably fast. I'm not expecting them to set the world alight, though. And they've been pretty reliable as well. Right, on to the Williams then. First thing you'll notice is they've got a Ferrari style nose, so they've gone for a very large vanity panel to make it almost flat right from the monocoque right down to the tip of the nose. So that's an interesting take on that one. The other thing to note as well, they missed the first test. They were testing with their old car. They did it on purpose, so they only had 2 tests, whereas most people had 3. There's a lot of new bits on it, to be honest. It's still an evolution of last year's car, but there is a lot of new bits. For example, they've got some blown wheel nuts, which are interesting. So it takes the air, gets gone through the brakes to cool it down, and it will then fire it out, and they can make it directional, so they've got fixed wheel nuts, whereas previously when they've done that, they've been spinning, so it's not worked quite so well, so they've gone fixed on that, so that's an interesting thing. They've also put a bridge in the exhaust channel, so that's an interesting thing. Caterham also did this. I'll get onto that in a moment. Unfortunately I haven't got any images of it, but they said basically they should put a bit of a bridge in that exhaust channel there, which would help aerodynamically, but it was considered illegal, so they've had to remove that. Other than that, they've looked pretty fast, much like they were last year, really. Most of last year they've looked pretty fast, so I'm expecting to be pretty fast this year. And they've had a few teething problems, but I do expect them to be reliable. Next up then is Toro Rosso. First thing you notice is they've gone in the opposite direction to Red Bull, in that they've got a vanity panel on the front, quite a large one, but it does still slope down, unlike the Ferrari one. And they've gone in a completely different aerodynamic direction to last year, apparently, so expect them to be a bit faster, but I don't expect them to be really into the midfield. I expect them to be just behind it, much like last year, but probably closer to it, and they look reliable. And here we have the Caterham. First thing you'll notice is that they've still got a step nose. I believe it's the same step nose from last year, so they've opted not to go for a vanity panel. So it's an interesting decision there, so it looks just as ugly as last year, unfortunately. The thing that you might not notice in these images is that there's more lime green. They've gone for a lighter shade of green. You'll definitely notice it out on track, so keep an eye out for that. But that's an interesting change. It's the first car produced from their new technical centre. They've completed a move to a new factory last year, so it'll be the first car produced from there. Visually it looks more technical than last year, doesn't it? It looks almost more like a Red Bull than a Caterham of last year, so it looks visually quicker, but we're yet to see how quick it really is. As I said before, the Caterham did also trial the Williams style exhaust bridge. In fact, they were the first to launch that. Once again, just like Williams, it was deemed illegal, so they've removed it, but it was an interesting how they came up with it first, actually before Williams, so I thought that was interesting. I expect them to be at the back, actually, because they haven't got any big updates all the way up until Barcelona, so what they were testing with was their package, so possibly even behind Marusia, but we'll have to wait and see in that, but they were very reliable in testing. And finally we have Marusia. The first thing you'll notice is that they haven't got a step nose, but I don't believe they're using a vanity panel. I think they're doing the same concept they did last year with just having a monocoque, because you don't actually need a step nose. It's similar to what McLaren did last year. So I don't think they're using a vanity panel, but I could be wrong. The other thing you'll notice is they've got very few sponsors. There's a lot of blank areas on the car, particularly just in front of the driver there and beside the driver on the side pods. So there isn't a lot of sponsors on this, so they could have some financial difficulties if they don't start filling up those spaces soon. Visually to the eye it looks more simple than the Caterham, but this is launch spec, so it could well be updated, ready for Melbourne, but it does look visually simpler than the Caterham, so we'll see how that plays out. As mentioned before, it's their first car with KERS, so Williams have provided them with a KERS unit, so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out this year. They actually launched it before the first test as well, whereas last year they didn't actually have any testing at all. They turned up in Melbourne, Australia, and they hadn't tested their car at all, so it's interesting that they've had all 3 tests, so we'll see how much of a difference that makes to them this year. Also, it's the only car still left using a Cosworth engine, and there's been some speculation that Cosworth won't be making a 2014 engine when they change massively, so they could have to move engine supplies next year, so that could provide some instability. I think they could be ahead of Caterham in the beginning of the year anyway, possibly. It'll be pretty close, but I think they could well be faster than Caterham, at least up until Spain when Caterham get their package together, but it's an interesting point, and they've been reasonably reliable. So here's a summary of the Barcelona test then, and it's sorted by times. So as you can see there, Mercedes actually posted the headline time of a 20.130, Ferrari a 20.494, and McLaren 21.444, so actually a second back from those front 2. Obviously you can't read too much from the test times, but it is still interesting, but obviously Red Bull wouldn't be that far down. Toro Rosso aren't slower than both Caterham and Marusia, so it's only so much can be read from it, but it is still interesting, particularly as Lewis Hamilton's pole lap last year, I believe, was a 21.7. So the Mercedes there, 1.6 seconds faster than McLaren at the same track last year. Obviously, a lot of things changed. They've got different temperatures, different tyres this year, and obviously the cars will have got faster, but that's still a big chunk of time to find. So it's pretty interesting. And if I now sort it by laps completed, this is both Barcelona test 1 and 2. So Mercedes once again top there. 481 laps they wound up completing. As I said, after having some bad reliability in Jerez, they've certainly turned it around to be by far the car with the most mileage on it. Ferrari was second, as to be expected. Ferrari are always reliable. McLaren third, as once again really to be expected. They're usually pretty reliable. Sauber 4th there, they're looking pretty good. Caterham 5th, they were rock solid in reliability really, not a lot went wrong with their cars at all. Force India there, they had a few reliability issues, but mostly it was pretty good. Marusia, they had once again a couple of worries, but nothing major I wouldn't say. Toro Rosso, again fine. Red Bull, I think just didn't post too many laps, I don't think they were worrying too much about their reliability to be honest. Williams, once again, their car was only launched at the beginning of this test, so it's expected they're going to have a 2 teething issue, so they're quite expected to be down there. But Lotus did have quite a few issues in the Barcelona test, so watch out for them. They could well have bad reliability this season. Okay, so my predictions then. This is going to be based on what I've seen visually on the cars, what I've heard technically about the cars, and what I've seen during the tests. But of course, there's way too many variables to take into consideration. For example, it could be raining in Melbourne, so it's just a rough indicator, and it's obviously my own prediction. So I'm putting Red Bull first then, and that's purely because they looked quick in the tests really. The car looks good and it just looks all really good for them. I don't think they'll be miles out front, but I think they will just about have it. I'm going to go for McLaren second. That is providing they get on top of their issues. If they can't get on top of their issues that they've been having, possibly 2 or 3 further down the list, but they might be faster than Red Bull if they can get properly on top of their issues. I'm going to push the boat out and go for Mercedes in third. That's mainly because I reckon they were developing their car for most of last year, or at least half of last year, because a top team like that with that much money do not go nowhere for the second half of the season. I know they went down the wrong way in terms of development, but I think they've got a good car this year, particularly with their headline tests. So I reckon they're going to be pretty quick. Ferrari in 4th then. I think they're looking pretty good, possibly a bit further up, but I think Mercedes might just have them, but it's going to be incredibly close to be honest, so it's very hard to tell, but I think Ferrari looking good, and once they develop their car a bit, I think they might be fastest, so Ferrari looking good this year. Lotus in 5th, that's pretty much a given really behind the top 4. I think they'll be ahead of the midfield. I don't think they've quite got the pace to be in amongst the top 4 this year like they did last year. I think they're not far off it, but they're looking pretty good anyway. Williams in 6th, so I think they'll be ahead of the midfield this year. They were pretty much ahead of midfield last year, but they just couldn't quite get it together because they had a bit of bad luck, and to be honest, the drivers let them down a little bit, so I reckon they'll, in terms of just the car, I think they'll be 6th fastest there. Sauber in 7th then, I think they'll be best of the rest really, so ahead of Force India and Toro Rosso and the like, I think they'll be around there. Force India in 8th, that's at least at the beginning of the season. I think once again towards the end of the season they'll be looking stronger, but I think towards the beginning at least they'll be 8th. 9th then, Toro Rosso, so once again bringing up the back of the midfield. I think they'll be a lot closer to the midfield than they were last year, but I don't think they can really get too far into it to be honest, and they'll be miles ahead of the slowest 2. I'm going to go Marusia in 10th then, so I think they'll be faster than Caterham this year, so far, and I think up until they get their Spain package, Caterham, I think Marusia might actually just have the edge, but once again, it'd be very close between them. And Caterham, I'm going to put them last. Once again, though, they could well be faster than Marusia. It's very difficult to tell between those two. So there we go, and there's my predictions. They're down. I'm not going to change this video, so we'll be interested to see on Saturday in Melbourne how they turn out. Thank you ever so much for watching, and if you could let me know what you thought of this video so I know whether or not to carry on this series, that'd be great. Thanks for watching.